Good morning. It's a real pleasure being here for the second Israel Symposium. My name is Milana Isaacson, and I'm a member of the BZD Advocacy Committee. I'm very honored to welcome and to introduce Natasha Mozgovaya, who is the Chief U.S. Correspondent for Haaretz. Before moving to the United States, she was a commentator on radio and TV in Israel and abroad. She is here today, and she will be speaking to us on reflections on the Obama-Netanyahu relationship. Please welcome Natasha Mozgovaya.
Boker Tov, good morning, can you hear me? Thank you so much for having us here, and thank you, as a representative of the Russian Jewish community in Israel, I just take this opportunity to thank the US Jewish community for all you've done for us. I know that you probably don't hear it much, but for me personally it's very important to say that. And of course, thank you for your bravery to wake up so early to talk politics in Israel. I know it's not always easy in the US now. So let's get to the subject. In the last 2.5 years, there were lots of discussions about President Obama and whether he really likes Israel. And I think for many Israelis, the answer right now is no. And there were questions about Prime Minister Netanyahu and whether he's serious about pursuing peace with the Palestinians, and whether his Bar Ilan speech, where he basically presented the two-state solution as an official goal of the Israeli government, whether it was genuine. And of course, there was the third big question, whether the Palestinians actually are interested in two-state solution or the two-stage solution, where the second stage is the elimination of the State of Israel. But too much attention was paid to the personal relationship between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Obama. Actually, it reached at some points an absurd levels of scrutiny. For example, I remember a reporter at the State Department briefing asking a question, asking a spokesman whether he called Netanyahu Bibi with an intent to humiliate him. Why didn't he call him Benjamin? I mean, there were questions asked whether the First Lady sent Netanyahu flowers when he came, whether they invited him to the Blair House or he had to stay in the hotel, whether they shunned him with a dinner. All these questions seemed quite irrelevant, to the peace process, because I think one of the reasons was that given the ideological gap between this US administration and the current Israeli government, the expectations that this peace process launched quite early into the Obama term, the expectations were so low that the reporters were just dealing with Bibi and Obama and what is between them, whether there is an instant chemistry, as if the relationship between the two countries are relied only upon this love or lack of love. So these days, of course, you don't hear any more promises to reach peace agreement in 1 year. And actually, since the November elections, we didn't see the special envoy Mitchell going too often to Ramallah or Jerusalem. There is a lot of talk about the sense of urgency to take advantage of the Arab Spring, so-called Arab Spring, although I think we already have a kind of hangover from it. But we didn't hear much specifics about how it can be realized under the current circumstances, and shortly we'll talk about it. So how did we get here, and why so much energy was wasted in Israel, and I think in the US Jewish community too, on the question how bad the relationship between President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu is. Before going to the US as Haaretz reporter, it was my first assignment with Haaretz. Before that, I worked for 8 years in Yediot Ahronot, which is considered a bit more mainstream. Haaretz is more a liberal newspaper. So I asked my colleague, who spent 5 years as an Israeli reporter in Washington, what is his most useful advice for me? And he told me, lower your expectations. I said, what do you mean? Don't we have special relationship? Can't the Israeli reporter open every door in the in the administration, you know, without earlier notice? And he said, you know, we do have a special relationship, but for the US, it's a big country. It's involved in almost, you know, any corner of the world, and Israel is important, but it's not always the first priority. So every time someone in Israel is asking me, what does President Obama say about this or that remark of some Israeli official, you know, I'm just looking at the schedule of President Obama that day, and I'm tempted to say, you know, this week there is a threat of government shutdown, and the Middle East is burning, and President is supposed, the US forces are supposed to start pulling out of Afghanistan, and there is Iran and oil prices, and not to mention Donald Trump and 2012 elections. So President Obama might not actually have time to look, you know, at the remark of some rabbi from Tzfat, although it could be very controversial in Israel. So I told it just to make, you know, to give some sense of proportion how it looks from Washington for an Israeli reporter, you know, trying to get some reactions. So the world might be obsessed with Israel, and I think it is, especially the foreign media, but with regard to the peace process, it seems sometimes that Israel and the Palestinians are obsessed with America, trying to score points here instead of trying to build some relationship with each other. If going back to Obama and Netanyahu, you might ask, were there mistakes done? I think yes, on both sides. For example, in Israel, I think it certainly look obsessively for some foreign policy clues in the middle name of President Obama. I mean, some people at the right wing call him Hussein Obama, and that's it. Because, you know, if we check the bigger pattern of the cooperation between the countries in the last 2.5 years, the administration official statements, they never contradicted the commitment to the security of Israel and friendship and cooperation between the two countries. Maybe it took some effort, you know, from the Israeli friends in the US, but I didn't ever see, you know, anything that at least during Obama's term as a president, that contradicted it. Was there something that President Obama could have done to prevent this pervasive mistrust of the Israeli society? You know, as a reporter, I can tell you that I'm sure that the US administration officials could speak more directly to the Israeli society, because, you know, they tell me sometimes, we are giving interviews to CNN and MSNBC, and we spoke to the Jewish community here at this event and that event, and we had a briefing for the US Jewish community leaders. Yes, but did you speak actually to the Israeli society that, you know, they suffer from some kind of anxiety now over all that is going on? Because, you know, sometimes people in Israel wish they weren't so special, and all those flotillas would sail to some place, I think, in dire need of the attention of the human rights activists. Let them sail to Congo, to Somalia, you know, to Syria, to Iran. It could be very useful. But the Israeli public does need some direct explanations of the US administration. What are they up to in these turbulent times? You know, Israelis might be deeply thankful for the US administration assistance with the financing of the Iron Dome and preserving the qualitative advantage of the IDF. And the security cooperation is actually at truly unprecedented level now, but Israeli public doesn't see President Obama as a close friend, and there were some missed opportunities. I mean, I hear a lot of people saying that, you know, we had so many crises one after another. President Obama just didn't have an opportunity to go to Jerusalem, except maybe, you know, when he skipped Israel in 2009 when he made his Cairo speech. I mean, he could go to Jerusalem, right? He was in the region. But still, you know, since then, because of this lack of direct dialogue, for journalists covering the US-Israeli relations, it became sort of political soap opera. I'm sorry to use this term, but that's how it looked. Because we had this unfortunate pattern of top officials from both countries, with respective visits, when the day of the visit or the day when the person was already in Jerusalem or in Washington, we had these announcements of the settlement expansions, on building new housing units. And it happened again and again, and sometimes people were asking, didn't Netanyahu really know about it? Are there some ministers trying, to humiliate himself, to embarrass him, or is the U.S. just making some huge elephant out of the point that wasn't so relevant for the previous administrations? So anyhow, I think the more relevant question that we should have asked in these 2.5 years is whether President Abbas is serious about reaching an agreement, than to ask whether President Obama is in love with Israel. And because with all due respect to the U.S. influence, there is only so much that the U.S. administration can do. Some left-wing activists in Israel, and obviously the Palestinians and the Arabs, they were disappointed that the Obama administration didn't put more pressure on Netanyahu on settlements at the beginning of his tenure. But I think, how much pressure could he put? The community here, the Israel supporters in the US were already alarmed by all those public statements condemning settlements. Actually, some people were saying that if he put enough pressure, maybe the Netanyahu's government would, fall apart, and there will be new, more centrist Israeli government. I just can't imagine myself the US president putting this, as an official policy goal, toppling the Israeli government. So let's say that the Palestinians didn't trust Netanyahu from the beginning, because when we had this, not so festive launch of the negotiations in Washington, I was going, between the hotels where the delegations, the Palestinian and the Israeli delegations were staying, and the White House. And the Israeli delegation was quite upbeat, and the Palestinian delegation members were very somber. And they were saying basically even then that they see Netanyahu as the same guy from '96. They don't really trust him. And I think that they have there is one interesting point that we should remember. The Israeli governments have changed several times, and the Palestinians, because they are not a democracy, they do have this kind of luxury of consistency, because for them it's the same process, going on for 20 years, although the actual negotiations took only about several months in those 20 years. Now the Palestinians are disappointed not only with Netanyahu, that they had no expectations of him, they're disappointed with America too. Probably most of you read the recent Newsweek interview that President Abbas gave. It was weird. I think it was kind of suicidal vis-a-vis his relationship with the U.S. because he said that, for example, that Senator Mitchell, when there were indirect talks, didn't pass any Palestinian ideas to the Israelis. So this is the argument that the White House denied. And then, of course, the Palestinians claim that, they won't talk without settlement freeze because they don't trust Netanyahu's intentions. Because if he wants to pursue two-state solutions, so, why do they continue building on the territory that is supposed to be transferred to the Palestinians? But, all these arguments are quite irrelevant now, because this week we had a big game changer, the announcement of the pending agreement between Fatah and Hamas. So let's take a look at the differences to this announcement on the Palestinian reconciliation from the Israeli government and the U.S. administration. The White House and the State Department, they were quite careful. They were saying, let's wait and see, because we do welcome the reconciliation, the unity, if the Hamas will recognize the right of Israel to exist, and if they will denounce violence. These are Quartet principles. But Prime Minister Netanyahu was very quick to lash out the idea. He was saying that Abbas has to decide peace with Israel or peace with Hamas. We had very different reaction from some Congress members who basically warned Abbas. Some even wrote letter to him that the U.S. assistance to the Palestinians will depend on his decision whether, there is no reason for the U.S. taxpayers to sponsor a terrorist organization that is shooting rockets at school buses in Israel. So the question is, what is going to happen next? Because if you look at the situation realistically, if Israel wants a peace agreement, they will need at some point Palestinian unity, unless you want two different Palestinian states like Fatahland and Hamastan or whatever you call them. And without doubt, President Abbas sees this unity as some concrete achievement because he is disappointed of the peace process. And of course, if he intends to go to the UN, he will say that he will say that I represent all the Palestinians and not only some kind of half of them. So this agreement is not signed yet. We don't know what is going to happen. Israel, of course, should be worried because Egypt already intends to open the border with Gaza, and we know what might happen then. But what is quite clear that Israel at this point, although it looks that there is nobody to talk to, we don't know who will be the leaders of the Arab revolutions. We don't know who will lead the Palestinians because they probably will have an elections pretty soon. But if Israel doesn't take initiative at this point, President Obama or any other US president cannot decide for Israel what will be the borders of Israel. I mean, so we are now, we will celebrate this month 63rd Independence Day of Israel, and we still have provisional borders. It's Israel has to decide how it wants to see the country, and I think it's about time to do it. Even because you cannot always be on the defensive, I mean, and now it really looks as bad as ever, unfortunately. I hope that at the question and answer so we can get to some more optimistic points, but my goal was primarily to outline the basic dilemma that we are facing now. Thank you.